Hi, guys. It's John here. It is Saturday, November 20th, 2021. Approaching the end of the year, the last month of 2021. Well, I'm sure a lot of people won't be disappointed to say goodbye to 2021. Um, it has been a very strange, very, very strange year. There's a few things I want to talk about. The thing that was at the forefront of my mind today as I thought about, because I knew I had this opportunity to record, um, was why I have taken such an interest in the psychic community. Because some people have asked me about that. And uh, I can explain it this way. 10 or 15 years ago, I was extremely, extremely concerned about the long term implications of climate change. And I thought, wow, we're really walking a tightrope here. We're right on the edge of a cliff. And it seemed like there was a fairly decent chance. We had a pretty decent chance of addressing that, and then along comes President 45. Well, who would have thought that would ever happen? And then later on, of course, we had this issue that we're this global health issue that we're all grappling with, and who would have thought that that would ever happen in our lifetimes? This was just incredible. I mean, I nobody saw that coming really. So anyway, back after 45 was elected, and I saw that there are the likely inability to deal with this global problem of wrecking our environment fell through the floor at that point because it was obvious that they're not going to do anything about it. And I started to get very, very concerned about the state of the world. And I couldn't figure out why this was happening. Just when we were just at that stage of having to do something monumental and epic in scope that had never happened before in human history. Along comes 45. So during that period of time, so for several years, I have sort of tuned into members of the psychic community, and I include within that, people who do readings, tarot card readings, and so forth, just because I was at such a loss to understand what the hell was going on. That and I'm not closed to that because I published a New Age magazine back in the 1980s, and I interacted with the psychic community back then. No problem with that at all. Um, but it seemed it was startling to say the least what was happening. So then I sort of started to tune in to see what was going to happen because I knew, like, for example, if I thought 45 got reelected and they further undermined democracy and all of the institutions that had the capability of addressing an issue on the scope of climate change, that we were in really deep trouble, like really significantly, horrifyingly deep trouble. And so, a lot of the members in the psychic and reader community were doing readings, of course, on politics. So I took a great interest in politics. Now, prior to then, I had been interested in politics, and I'm always reading the news. Like every day, I'm aware of what's going on, and I read. I try and read good sources of information. I'm a discriminating consumer in that regard, but this was way outside the scope of anything normal, right? So um, that and so I turned to that those other sources, these alternate sources of information, just to try and understand why this was happening, most importantly. And I'm still not sure why what's happening is happening. I get that this is kind of like a last ditch sort of battle between forces of light and darkness. And that, we're still sort of riding along the edge of that precipice. And depending on who you listen to, you'll get, on the one hand, that we're ascending into higher dimensions of consciousness, and on the other, that, we are uh, close to the edge here. And I waver in between those two perspectives quite frequently. So that's why I kind of turned to the reader community, because I was trying to understand what was happening on a more spiritual or higher level. Like, how could this be happening? I'm still not entirely satisfied with what I know about that. I know that third dimensional reality is like a stage that, and we're just to some extent, we're all actors, whether conscious or not, in this drama. But this leads to all kinds of interesting thoughts and discussion that may not seem immediately obvious. And what comes to me is that here's the other interesting, really interesting thing about this whole phenomenon, right? So, like I said, I've been following a lot of readers and astrologers and other people just to see if anybody could lend any kind of insight into this madness that we're experiencing. And it is epically mad. I mean, when perhaps the last world wars, you know, probably, I guess, because this, what's happening on such a global scale that it exceeds what happened in the 1960s with Vietnam and everything, with the possible exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is big drama. Following along this train of thought a little further, there's an interesting thing, and just also to put this into the mix as well. I myself have quite a few psychic experiences, but at least at this point in time, I'm not like constantly chatting with my guides. It happens sometimes, but not. It's not constant, and it's not. Doesn't seem to be entirely under my control. It happens at times, for sure, absolutely. And I do have dreams, of visionary dreams, and things like that, but not like some people who can literally sit there and have communication or discussions with their guides. And even if I did do that, I would want uh, reinforcement or reassurance from other sources that what I was thinking or experiencing or feeling or perceiving wasn't just specific to me. So I would still look outside myself to see what other people are saying. And when you do look out at what other people are saying, you get an awful lot of mixed perspectives. Now, sometimes, especially when it comes to how bad are things going to get, when is that going to happen, that kind of stuff. There's some people who seem to be more optimistic and some seem to be more pessimistic. And I don't go really for the far flung conspiracy theory types at all, actually. Really have a huge disdain for that. So, and that may sound odd to say that when you're talking about psychics, but I don't question psychic abilities. I've just had way too many experiences myself, and so have many other people I know. And so that's just something I just assume to be legit. Although there's some out there, of course, that are not, but the ones that I subscribe to and I listen to a lot. And I have time to listen to these people because that's what I do when I'm working all day. Like I'm always listening to either spiritual stuff or psychic stuff, and of course sometimes or channeled stuff, and uh, I'm staying abreast of the news as well. So I'll listen to podcasts and things like that. Anyway, I don't want to ramble. Here's the thing, okay? I recall back around 2012 there was a bunch of us, at least in my circle, who had this real feeling of dread, like something, like a real sense of unease. Now, of course, this was around the end of the Mayan calendar and all that stuff. There was a lot of things going on, but this was deeper and broader than that. This wasn't just superficial. There was something at that time, and I myself was having sort of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic dreams at that time. And I discussed this with my friends at the time who also were having similar experiences. There was a something happened there. Either we flipped onto a different timeline or we just made it through a probability that might have occurred that could have been sort of, let's just say, catastrophic of some kind, because the visions and things that I was having at the time were very apocalyptic. So we made it through that somehow, right? And then it took, for those of us who were really sensitive at that time, um, it took us a few years to really adjust to sort of the new normal because we had sort of been building up with that energy for a long time around then. And then, nothing really seemed to happen. I have to add one other thing here, too, which is that when I was a child, I mean, a young child, say something like maybe age 7, 8, up until like 14 or whatever, I had an incredible fascination with wilderness survival. This may sound really weird, but at the time, I either got a hold of or read every book on the subject that I could find that believe was in print. That includes people who went and lived in the wilderness on their own and survived, as well as, old school, old timer sort of techniques about how people survived in the bush in past times. And this was really weird. I mean, I'm talking like fishing, hunting, and trapping and all that stuff, and how to build shelters and, you know, basically survive with almost nothing. So I literally had this obsession with this um, whole thing, and I actually went and practiced a lot of that, building shelters and spending time in the woods and stuff on my own as a young child. Now, I don't know, I never really knew for sure whether that was because of past life experiences or whether I intuitively felt that there was going to be a time when I would need to have those skills at some point in the future. And to some extent, that concept was reinforced by some input I had from other people who were psychic, who saw me in a dystopian sort of future being a leader or helper for people under these sort of apocalyptic conditions. Now, that sounds kind of crazy, but it's true. And it was very odd. First, I mean, I spent time in the country as a child in the summers, but and grew up in the city. My father was very outdoorsy, uh, but it was a very strange obsession for a young person to have. So I'm just adding that into this because it might have something to do with some of the potentialities that didn't actually occur, but possibly could have. And another thing is that I ended up living in the woods on my own for 3 years in my early 20s with a bunch of people who had sort of gone back to the land. They were part of the late 60s, early 1970s whole back to the land, getting away from sort of the countercultural movement, which was also very unusual for somebody who grew up in the city and I read every book in our house, including the encyclopedia when I was a child. So I was not anti intellectual or anti civilization. So this never fully made sense on its own. So here we are now in the latter teens and the early 2020s. And there's a lot of people who are utilizing and expressing their psychic abilities and talking to their guides and channeling and stuff like that. And it seems very obvious. It's just a logical conclusion if you think about it, that spirit or the spiritual dimensions are really making an effort to communicate through certain people to us down here, and that therefore, logically, there has to be a reason for that. And I don't think the reason just has to do with some great awakening that's occurring, you know, ascension or whatever you want to call it. I think this is just my rational mind and perhaps me being a bit pessimistic, but I'm not the only one. I think that they are interceding to try and help us shift up or over or around some probabilities. In other words, I don't think that there would be such a massive level of involvement from the other dimensions here now unless it was significantly important. And I don't think it's just about a big shift in consciousness because they're not stupid. They could have communicated, psychically with people for hundreds, if not thousands of years on a large scale, right? It is said that the veil is thinning, and I would concur with that. But I think there is something special about this time. And if we sort of logically follow that train of thought, it sort of suggests that we are at some kind of major crossroads. Now, that implies that we can go in different directions, that there's different potential outcomes. And of course, I support the one that is sane and always have. But I can't help myself but to arrive at that conclusion. It's just based on the evidence. They don't tend to intervene unless it's necessary. That they don't do it in my life, they don't do it in other people's lives, right? Typically. Now, we are still witnessing a lot of things going on in the world that are just really crazy. I don't think that that's going to subside immediately, at least not for some time. You know, the global health issue is a big problem right now in Europe, for example. There's a lot of very serious political and social issues going on in our neighbors to the south and elsewhere. We have to make an epic, historic, grand transition away from fossil fuels, and we have to do this like in record time. There's a lot of things that are very major that needs to happen very quickly. So why doesn't that happen? This is my view, is that reality, what we experience and what we inhabit in here, is a reflection. If you took all of the people's consciousness on the planet and blended them all together, that the reality that we experience is a reflection or a manifestation of that consciousness. Now, there's people like me and people like you and others on different points on the spectrum, but the amalgam of everybody is basically the state of the world. And so, you know, those of us who are more progressive and concerned about things like social and environmental justice and stuff like that, you know, we look at this and go like, this is madness, right? But we're outliers in many respects. There's plenty of us, right? There's more people on the left and the center left and than there are typically on the right. But, you know, there's still this raging sort of chasm, and it seems to be widening, that we have to overcome. And yeah, individually, of course, we lift up our consciousness and we can affect those around us. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons that spirit is engaging with us in the way that they are, and to the degree that they are, and the frequency with which they are. So there is a desire to push us over or up onto a new level. And I don't think that we'd be receiving those pushes unless we needed it. Now, if that's the point of this little discussion, that you know they're intervening. Hi, I had to pause the recording there and resume again today, the following day. So anyway, the point I was trying to get at was that the scope of what appears to be sort of a spiritual intervention in the fate of Earth and humanity seems to be extremely significant and profound. Now, many years ago, an enlightened spiritual teacher of mine said that there had only been a few times where the Creator had actually literally intervened in the affairs of humanity in order to shift the outcome, that it was an extremely rare event. And what I, intellectually at least, but more than that, but what I perceive is that the level of intervention that's going on right now is probably unprecedented from the other dimensions. Now, that suggests and implies that whatever the stakes are incredibly profound and probably much more so than most human beings at this point realize. That we may not understand. Whoa, wow, strong chills, very strong chill, like incredibly strong chills here right now. That we may not understand for centuries the significance of what is occurring right now at this point in time. And I'm getting the impression that we are definitely at a crossroads, that there's two potential outcomes or splits, and that spirit is intervening to set us on the course with the best possible outcome. But obviously, the two courses would not exist if there wasn't the potential to go down the other path, which I believe would be very dark. And that is fundamentally why so many people are engaging with other realms of consciousness that are non material. So I express all this just because it's something I have been thinking about for a long time, actually, sort of for years, pondering this whole thing. And, let's be clear. I think that, if we follow some of the findings of the research by people like Dolores Cannon, that there were a lot of souls that incarnated here around this time period to be here at this time to help Earth make this transition. So generally, though, I mean that for anybody who's done a lot of research or reading or thinking about what's going on with this lifting of consciousness, none of that may be surprising. However, I am looking at this right now from this very high level view and trying to understand what is behind the phenomenon that we are witnessing. And what I'm saying is that it's bigger than most people realize. It's not just about us as individuals waking up, it's about us as a collective shifting our energy. And I want to comment on there's a whole bunch of things I want to comment on, when fortune provides me the time and opportunity to do so. But this polarization that we're witnessing in the world is a reflection of these two potentialities. There's the light and the dark. And fundamentally, I was talking earlier about how what we are collectively experiencing is a product of the amalgam of our consciousness, and that if we want to go down the path of the more beneficial or pleasant potentiality, then the objective is to shift the consciousness enough so that the darker aspects of human experience do not have the power to take us down the darker path. And that means that as individuals, we have to be engaged. So, like for example, I have long, for many, many years, many like decades actually, and this was brought to light again by my work on climate related issues. I have long asked myself, how is it possible that we can have, for example, autocratic rulers? Like, and really, because we have so much power as individuals, I've often asked myself, why the hell do people put up with that crap? Why, why? What is it about human beings that allows them to be enslaved in effect that way? Because it's consciously or unconsciously, it's an act of will. And I've just been so baffled by, this whole thing. There are entire nations that allow themselves to be enslaved by a few nasty people. And I'm like, why on earth do people put up with that crap? It's that simple. It's because these people are disempowered, or they don't recognize or hold or own their own power. And it occurs on such a large scale. It's just absolutely mind boggling. Now, one could argue that that is somewhat a function, or was somewhat a function, of the Piscean age, which we are leaving, which is, this sort of lack of backbone to some extent individually. And that, this shift into the age of Aquarius is people aren't going to put up with that kind of crap. And here we are at this crossing this threshold, and I personally, and I've posted some commentary about how I see this Aquarian age playing out, and it can't come soon enough. And as I've said before, when Pluto moves into Aquarius is when things are really going to start shifting in that direction. But that's still a couple years out, 2023, 24 before really Pluto settles into Aquarius. I guess in the big scheme of things, that's not a long time. But for someone like me, who just sees all this bullshit and is baffled by the fact that people put up with this. Like, for example, with at COP26, we basically have the fossil fuel industry calling the shots, you know, and I'm like, how is that possible? There's like, there's billions of human beings who are going to suffer from, the consequences of this inaction. And yet, a handful of complete, sociopaths or psychopaths are going to dictate the fate of humanity. Like, what the hell? I've suffered from that, just the shock of that awareness for decades, So anyway, um, I I'm a bit all over the place here, but I think the most important thing that I want to say is that we can just look at what's happening. We can look at how spirit is, breaking through and connecting and communicating with so many people en masse, and we can therefore logically assume that it's very important. Whatever is happening right now is extremely important, and that yes, we are at a threshold and crossroads, um, and that they wouldn't be doing it if it didn't matter and if it wasn't really important. So it's a big deal. It's not just the symptoms, i.e., people having psychic experiences. It's way bigger than that. We're talking about the fate of humanity for possibly ever after. So there's a lot riding on this. I take that very seriously. And I hope that humanity makes the right decision. I think what let me say one other thing. When I was doing a lot of the climate related work, there was a lot of people who were sort of nihilists who basically said, "Oh, we're screwed, we're effed, throwing in the towel, nothing we can do. It doesn't matter. We're all civilization is done. It's over." I was never a nihilist, and I was better informed than most about the severity of the crisis and the potential outcomes. But I would never once was a nihilist. I would never quit, never give in, never surrender. There's just too much at stake. We can't. Now, we hope that there's technologies and, perhaps even intervention, to help us overcome some things that we don't know how to overcome at this point in time, technically. Um, but, as pessimistic as I was about and am about that situation, I would never surrender, and I would never become nihilistic, because that is a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We can't allow that to happen. So no matter how crazy things get in this context, politically and socially, you know, if the dark side's at play, what they want to do is they want to undermine us, cause us to question ourselves, to doubt ourselves, to be in fear. And I'm not suggesting we not be informed, but we can never surrender. And that's why we're here. So, it can be very easy to sort of sink into a state of depression or disempowerment, but that is actually serving the dark side. So we can't let that happen to us as individuals and to those who we are aligned with. We have to support each other. Very important. So possibly one of the most important things that we can do right now for ourselves and for humanity is to ask for help. Ask for intervention. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's serious. Yeah, it's big. Yeah, it matters a lot. Um, and yeah, we can't give in to despair. We have to keep fighting. That is why we incarnated here. I'll leave it at that. Have a good day. Bless you all.